That song is fantastic. I've never heard it before. It was so good. So, the tale of the shadow of the cross might seem like a funny story to you, and it was, but it was also a deeply personal time for me. I was stuck in committee myself. I was deeply in love with Unitarian Universalism and its values, and I was expressing that love by going to seminary, where we talked about this shadow of the cross stuff. We wouldn't have used that language, but we talked a lot about the rapid pace of change in society and how we might adapt to meet that change. But we had those conversations in a university, mirroring the old ways of doing things with every detail of our structure, with all the expense that goes with academia and the inertia and the gatekeeping. Academia can be, as one member of Capital told me years ago, a bit of a self-licking ice cream cone, and that doesn't lead itself to creativeness. By approaching this issue only from an academic perspective, we were taking down the cross, but continuing to function within the confines of its shape. I sucked at all of this, by the way. Even when I am not critiquing the very premise of school, I'm a terrible student. Forcing my brain to study has always felt like trying to wrestle an active toddler into a car seat. Eventually, they would give me the phrase ADHD and medication and messages and strategies, but that took a while. And in the meantime, the very walls of seminary dripped with messages that every school gives to people like me. You're disordered, you're broken, you're the wrong shape. But if you try hard enough, you can redeem yourself by squeezing into what is asked of you. This is what school says to me, and to be honest, with our processes and our meetings and our email chains, this is sometimes what my religion says to me as well. So my seminary years were a wrestling exercise between my student self, trying to give it more effort, and my firework brain, trying to give it maybe less effort. Student self wanted to study sermons about privilege like we were supposed to do. Firework brain wanted to watch stand-up comedians. Firework brain argued these comedians, they're unpacking all of the same concepts using more accessible language. Isn't it worth learning how to do that? Maybe all this side stuff I was doing, ad hoc gatherings I helped create, or media experiments, or online groups, maybe those things were not me failing to buckle down at school so much as they were me experimenting on how to expand beyond the shadow of the cross. Firework brain can be pretty wily in an argument. She can make a good argument if it might get her out of doing her homework. She's brighter than you'd think, given how little she reads. So the farther away that I moved from this powerless position of a grade school child, also the more assertive firework brain became. I would sit in my school lecture and the usual messages would run through my mind of, the problem is that I need to be better at paying attention. And now there was a voice that argued back. That voice argued, maybe the problem isn't that I need to work harder to pay attention. Maybe the problem is that that guy needs to work a little bit harder and be more interesting. When it wasn't dry, the stuff that I was learning was also, it was not what I expected. I had always had these stories in my head, like that of Michael Servetus, the Unitarian martyr chased and persecuted for his brave act of speaking the truth to John Calvin. Turns out, if you read Servetus's writing in his own words, he is very smart and he's very articulate. He's also pretty obnoxious. He doesn't just tell his truth. He stalks John Calvin. He writes him letters arguing every little point. He writes and distributes books and pamphlets. At one point, Calvin has a warrant out for Servetus's arrest. Servetus goes to Calvin's talk and sits in the front row. Servetus did not deserve what happened to him. Nobody deserves that. But after reading his actual words, dripping with arrogance and condescension, there's a part of me that sympathized a little bit with John Calvin. Or Emerson and Thoreau. I had always admired the transcendentalists, how they forged these intentional, beautiful lives full of integrity. Learning a bit more about it, Thoreau could retreat to the woods to suck the marrow out of life because he was living on land that Emerson gave him for free. Where'd the land come from, Emerson? And that story about how Thoreau is making this bold choice to live a simple life in the woods, I think we can fairly say that Thoreau didn't invent the idea of living simply in those woods. Not only had people there lived that way before, you didn't have to go very far back in time to find that that was the only way people were living. Thoreau did not invent it. Also, Thoreau went on these long walks, wrote down his thoughts because he had all the time in the world. This whole system supported him in that. He had no kids to take care of. He had free land. And Emerson's wife was doing his laundry. Louisa May Alcott, meanwhile, lives a few miles away, she's making all the same theological points about simplicity and intentionality in what would become the best-selling novel, Little Women. But she was writing in a way that was not academic or prosaic. She had to sell her writing in order to make enough money to feed her family, because that was one of the few ways that a woman could earn a living back then. She had to do this because her father, who should have been earning that living by the customs of the time, didn't have a job. He was spending most of his time in his study discussing philosophy with Emerson and Thoreau. And so Louisa talked about all those same concepts, but she did it with wit and character, and she did it in a way that was accessible. She put it in a form where children and adults from all over the country could be entertained and instructed. She used it to feed her family, too. Facing a world that was not built for women to participate in the way she wanted to, she found a way to make it fit. Oh, she did all that while doing her own laundry, by the way. So humor was my outlet for my frustration with our history and our identity, and in particular, our academic struggles. But it wasn't just my outlet. I was not the only bored student. We found each other. We used our pent-up irritation and our very esoteric knowledge to play witty and historically specific pranks on each other. One time, the Lucy Stone, Unitarian Universalist Lucy Stone Housing Co-op in Boston posted online that they were accepting applications for new roommates. A few of us applied as mostly dead Unitarians and Universalists. We applied as Michael Servetus, and under food allergies, we listed barbecue. We applied as Emerson. Under pets, we wrote Thoreau. We applied as people we thought were missing from our mainstream history, too. Reverend Olympia Brown, the first woman in the US to be ordained. Dorothy Dix, whose tireless lobbying transformed conditions for institutionalized people in the United States, Canada, and several other countries. These women's names are not as well known, but when you line their lives up against Thoreau in the Woods or Servetus with his letters, you cannot deny that their stories deserve just as much acknowledgement. So all of this pranking was followed by a week of messaging and kerfuffle and coordinating and giggling, and it all left me feeling warm and connected. Connected with my peers, connected with my UU heritage, gently poking fun at the things we thought deserved to be knocked down a peg or two, lifting up stories that aren't always told, using humor as a tool. This prank connected me with my values, too, as we coordinated to know just how far to push things, because a good prank is just as funny for the people being pranked as it is for the pranksters. Above all, that prank left me feeling part of Unitarian Universalism. We understood shared jokes because they arose out of shared stories, shared culture. This was a space that had room for me, where I didn't have to change shape to fit into a prescribed shadow. I didn't want it to end. So on a whim, I created a Facebook group and named it the UU Hysterical Society. This is a play on the UU Historical Society, who have changed their name a couple of times since then. Nobody ever gets the joke. They just point out that the word hysterical has a troublesome history. It's been used as a weapon to discredit and sometimes harm women, which is true. Throughout history, the symptoms of hysteria have been very varied. Sometimes it was a woman who was struggling with what we would now call a mental illness or disability. Sometimes it was a physical condition like epilepsy, or a life choice like deciding not to get married. Often, it was a woman who was unable to toe the line in some way or just unwilling. Sometimes it was a woman who was an awesome firebrand warrior pioneer of strength, too. Hysteria was a catch-all word for any woman who was being inconvenient, who must be treated. A hysterical woman is a woman who's the wrong shape. And I, who was struggling to fit into the shadow of the cross, I loved my UU Hysterical Society. It was an expression of my values. It was a space that fit me. And it was a break from the ministerial formation process at a time when that process was starting to break me. For years, I didn't think of that as anything other than my own personal refuge, fun place. By the time I clued into what was starting to happen, we had about 20,000 members in the Facebook group. Someone posted that she nearly drove her car off the road after spotting a UU church. She said she thought we were a joke religion made up for the purposes of the UU Hysterical Society, and that seeing a real UU church was like spotting a unicorn. She said she almost drove her car off the road yelling, "They're real, they're real." And I thought, wow, we are telling 20,000 people about what Unitarian Universalism is. And then I thought, shit, 20,000 people are learning about what Unitarian Universalism is from us. I'm not actually the right person for that job. I, I didn't finish the assigned reading. Fortunately, I didn't have to be the right person for the job. A religious educator named Kathy joined the team at about that time and started to fill in some of the gaps that weren't really my strong suits. Together, we stewarded the group as it grew, and I toyed with the idea that maybe we could become something more, specifically maybe a legal entity that could apply for grants to fund all of this extra work Kathy was putting in. But even thinking along those lines felt presumptive. Who did I think we were? This isn't a rhetorical question. I had no idea who we were or why we were. I was still thinking in the shadow of the cross. And then in November of 2019, something happened that changed my perspective forever. My friend, Reverend Fulgence Ndadejimana, a UU minister, approached me to ask for help raising money to settle a group of refugees. So in November of 2019, the Hysterical Society held its first charity fundraiser. It was holiday themed because Christmas, refugees. We sold funny PDFs like labels for wine that said, "Hey, this was water a minute ago," and tags that said, "It's the thought that counts, and I way overthought this." That seemed particularly UU to me. We sold ornaments that said, "You're not failing to Christmas properly," which I really liked. We sold flasks that said, "For when thoughts and prayers are not enough," and "This is my spiritual practice." We raised more than $16,000 through donations and sales. This wasn't enough for that whole group of refugees, but Fulgence used that donation as a seed to convince other donors to join in, and he was able to make up that whole amount. And then something in me shifted. Tromping through that snow every day to the post office, arms full of packages, it was like a clarifying pilgrimage of some kind, except a pilgrimage with the Canada Post guy in the midpoint looking at me curiously. And eventually the guy says, "Okay, I'll bite. What's a UU Hysterical Society?" It was written on the return address. And I didn't respond to him the way I usually did, which was to look down with embarrassment and mumble, I run a Facebook group that makes fun of my religion." This is not an accurate answer, but it usually ends the conversation. Instead, in that moment, I lifted my head up and I grinned at him. And I answered with confidence. I said we were a group that was about joy and community and refugees. We'd started by gathering around laughter. Frankly, that is good enough. There's nothing wrong with running a group just for joy. It's like running a soup kitchen for the soul. But we were also turning into something more than that. Still about laughter and community, but also about bringing dignity to people who deserved a new chance to build a new life. The Canadian not-for-profit Mirth and Dignity was incorporated the following month, and I figured I had found my fairy tale ending and my own little niche. This is not proven to be the case exactly. It turns out that the one thing Firework Brain likes even less than school is filling out paperwork for Revenue Canada, which is not also well suited to who I am, but we've figured it out. We've managed. People have helped me when I needed it. And so we've grown into an organization that has a bunch of different fun-based projects and communities, and I'm not going to tell you about those. They're not important. You can find them on the website. What I want to draw your attention to is that overarching arc, that feeling of not quite fitting, which is, I find, a feeling that a lot of Unitarian Universalists can empathize with. Many of us became UUs because we didn't fit into the communities we were born into. We figured out how to be diverse theologically, although that is in some ways a work in progress. But I believe that we are also right now in a process of creating a diversity of structures, of types of different ways to be UU. We have together inherited a shadow of a cross, a set of institutions and practices that don't always work for every community in the modern era. I've heard from people who feel like they're tired, like they're trying to do too much, like they feel focused on the wrong things. I think we need to lean into those feelings, not shy away from them. I have no idea where that will lead, any more than I had any idea where that prank in 2015 would lead. But I do know that the first step is to give ourselves permission to be who we are, not who we think we're supposed to be. When we feel like we're cracking a bit under the weight of trying to do all the things we've always done in the way we've always done them, I think we should think of that. We should not think of that as breaking. I think we should lean in and we should think of it as hatching. Where do you struggle to be the right shape? What do you struggle most to do? What would happen if you reframed that struggle just a little bit? Not as everything happens for a reason or think of the glass half full, not that, but as What are the strengths that go along with this struggle? What can you do that nobody else can do? Sometimes this lens doesn't work. Some things just suck. But sometimes you find gems in that reframing. Sometimes the same traits that made you bad at what you thought you were supposed to be doing, those are the very traits that make you great at something else. What are the places where we struggle most as a UU faith? And what would happen if we rethought things? If we saw ourselves as hatching, as growing into a new shape, a new diversity of shapes, old ones and new ones intertwined together in a new kind of ecosystem. As UUs like to say, the cracks are how the light gets in. And this is true. But the cracks aren't only how the light gets in. Sometimes, on a good day, the cracks are also how our light gets out.